exercise was now out of the question. I was glad of it. I never liked long walks, especially on chilly afternoons. Dreadful to me was the coming home in the raw twilight, with nipped fingers and toes, and a heart saddened by the chidings of Bessie, the nurse, and humbled by the consequences of my physical inferiority to Eliza, John, and Georgiana Read. To the said Eliza, John, and Georgiana were now clustered round their mamma in the drawing room. She lay reclined on a sofa by the fireside, and with her darlings about her. For the time, neither quarrelling nor crying, looked perfectly happy. Me, she had dispensed from joining the group, saying she regretted to be under the necessity of keeping me at a distance, but that until she heard from Bessie, and could discover by her own observation that I was endeavouring in good earnest to acquire a more sociable and childlike disposition, a more attentive and sprightly manner, something lighter, franker, more natural, as it were, she really must exclude me from privileges intended only for contented, happy little children. What does Bessie say I have done? I asked. Jane, I don't like cavaliers or questioners. Besides, there is something truly forbidding in a child taking up her elders in that manner. Be seated somewhere, and until you can speak pleasantly, remain silent. A small breakfast room adjoined the drawing room. I slipped in there. It contained a bookcase. I soon possessed myself of a volume, taking care that it should be one stored with pictures. I mounted into the window seat. Gathering up my feet, I sat cross-legged like a Turk, and, having drawn the red moreen curtain nearly close, I was shrined in double retirement. Folds of scarlet drapery shut in my view to the right hand. To the left was the clear panes of glass, protecting, but not separating me from the drear November day. At intervals, while turning over the leaves in my book, I studied this aspect of that winter afternoon. Afar, it offered a pale blank of mist and cloud. Near, a scene of wet lawn and storm-beat shrub, with ceaseless rain sweeping away wildly before a long and lamentable blast. I returned to my book, Bewick's History of British Birds. The letterpress, therefore, I cared little for, generally speaking, and yet there were certain pages that, child as I was, I could not pass quite as a blank. Each picture told a story, mysterious, often to my undeveloped understanding and imperfect feelings, yet ever profoundly interesting as the tale Bessie sometimes narrated on winter evenings, when she chanced to be in good humour, and when, having brought her ironing table to the nursery hearth, she allowed us to sit about it, and, while she got up Mrs. Read's lace frills and crimped her nightcap borders, fed our eager attention with passages of love and adventure, taking from old fairy tales and older ballads, she has run out in the rain. Bad animal. It is well I drew the curtain, thought I, and I wished fervently he might not discover my hiding place, nor would John Reed have found it out himself. He was not quick either of vision or conception, but Eliza just put her head in at the door and said at once, "She is in the window seat, to be sure, Jack." And he came out immediately, for I trembled at the idea of being dragged forth by the said Jack. "What do you want?" I asked, with awkward diffidence. "Say, what do you want, Master Reed?" was the answer. "I want you to come here." And, seating himself in an armchair, he imitated by a gesture that I was to approach and stand before him. John Reed was a schoolboy of 14 years old, 4 years older than I, for I was but 10. John had not much affection for his mother and sisters, and an antipathy for me. He bullied and punished me, not 2 or 3 times a week, nor once or twice a day, but continually. Every nerve I had feared him, and every morsel of flesh on my bones shrank when he came near. There were moments when I was bewildered by the terror he inspired, because I had no appeal whatever against either his menaces or his inflictions. The servants did not like to offend their young master by taking my part against him, and Mrs. Reed was blind and deaf on the subject. She never saw him strike or heard him abuse me, though he did both now and then in her very presence, more frequently, however, behind her back. Habitually obedient to John, I came up to his chair. He spent some 3 minutes in thrusting out his tongue at me as far as he could without damaging the roots. I knew he would soon strike, and while dreading the blow, I mused on the disgusting and ugly appearance of him who would presently deal it. I wonder if he read that notion in my face, for, all at once, without speaking, he struck suddenly and strongly. I tottered, and on regaining my equilibrium, retired back a step or 2 from his chair. "That is for your impudence in answering Mamma a while since," said he. "Go and stand by the door, out of the way of the mirror and the windows." I did so, not at first aware what his intention, but when I saw him lift and poise the book, and stand in act to hurl it, I instinctively started aside with a cry of alarm. Not soon enough, however. The volume was flung. It hit me, and I fell, striking my head as the French would say. I was conscious that a moment's mutiny had already rendered me liable to strange penalties, and, like any other rebel slave, I felt resolved in my desperation to go all lengths. Hold your arms, Miss Abbot. She's like a mad cat. For shame, cried the lady's maid. What shocking conduct, Miss Eyre, to strike a young gentleman, your benefactress's son, your young master. Master? How is he my master? Am I a servant? No, you are less than a servant, for you do nothing for your keep. There, sit down and think over your wickedness. They had got me by this time into the apartment indicated by Mrs. Reed, and had thrust me upon a stool. My impulse was to rise from it like a spring. Their 2 pairs of hands arrested me instantly. If you don't sit still, you must be tied down, said Bessie. Miss Abbot, lend me your garters. She would break mine directly. Miss Abbot turned to divest a stout leg of the necessary ligature. This preparation for bonds, and the additional ignominy it inferred, took little of the excitement out of me. Don't take them off, I cried. I will not stir. I guarantee whereof I attached myself to my seat by my hands. Mind you don't, said Bessie, when she had ascertained that I was really subsiding. She loosened her hold of me. Then she and Miss Abbot stood with arms folded, looking darkly and doubtfully on my face, incredulous of my sanity. She never did so before, at last said Bessie, turning to the Abigail. But it was always in her, was the reply. I've told Mrs. often my opinion about that child, and Mrs. agreed with me. She's an underhand little thing. I never saw a girl of her age with so much cover. Bessie answered not, but ere long, addressing me, she said, You ought to be aware, miss, that you are under obligations to Mrs. Reed. She keeps you. If she were to turn you off, you would have to go to the poorhouse. I said nothing to these words. They were not new to me. My very first recollections of existence included hints of the same kind. This reproach of my dependence had become a vague sing-song in my ear, very painful and crushing, but only half intelligible. Miss Abbot joined in. And you ought not to think yourself on an equality with the Mrs. Reed and Master Reed, because Mrs. kindly allows you to be brought up with them. They will have a great deal of money, and you will have none. It is your place to be humble, and to try to make yourself agreeable to them. What we tell you is for your good, added Bessie, in no harsh voice. You should try to be useful and pleasant. Then, perhaps, you would have a home here. But if you become passionate and rude, Mrs. will send you away, I am sure. Besides, said Miss Abbot, God will punish her. He might strike her dead in the midst of her tantrums. And then, where would she go? Come, Bessie, we will leave her. I wouldn't have her heart for anything. Say your prayers, Miss Eyre, when you are by yourself, for if you don't repent, something bad might be permitted to come down the chimney and fetch you away. They went, shutting the door and locking it behind them. The Red Room was a spare chamber, very seldom slept in. I might say never, indeed, unless when a chance influx of visitors at Gateshead Hall rendered it necessary to turn to account all the accommodation it contained. windows drawn down were half shrouded in festoons and falls of similar drapery. The carpet was red. The table at the foot of the bed was covered with a crimson cloth. The walls were of a soft fawn colour, with a blush of pink in it. The wardrobe, the toilet table, the chairs were of darkly polished old mahogany. Out of these deep surrounding shades rose high and glared white the piled up mattresses and pillows of the bed, spread with a snowy Marseille counterpane. Scarcely less prominent was an ample-cushioned easy chair near the head of the bed, also white, with a footstool before it, and looking, as I thought, like a pale throne. Mr. Reed had been dead 9 years. It was in this chamber he breathed his last. Here he lay in state, hence his coffin was borne in by the undertaker's men, and since that day a sense of dreary consecration had guarded it from frequent intrusions. My seat, to which Bessie and the bitter Miss Abbott had left me riveted, was a low ottoman near the marble chimney-piece. The bed rose before me. To my right hand there was the high, dark wardrobe, with subdued, broken reflections varying the gloss of its panels. To my left were the muffled windows. A great looking-glass between them repeated the vacant majesty of the bed and room. I was not quite sure whether they had locked the door, and when I dared move, I got up and went to see. Alas, yes, no jail was ever more secure. Returning, I had to cross before the looking-glass. My fascinated glance involuntarily explored the depth it revealed. All looked colder and darker in that visionary hollow than in reality, and the strange little figure there, gazing at me with a white face and arms speckling the gloom, and glittering eyes of fear moving where all else was still, had the effect of a real spirit. I thought it like one of the tiny phantoms, half fairy, half imp. Bessie's evening stories represented as coming out of lone, ferny dells in moors, and appearing before the eyes of blighted travellers. I returned to my stool. I was at discord in Gateshead Hall. I was like nobody there. I had nothing in harmony with Mrs. Reed, or her children, or her chosen vassalage. If they did not love me, in fact, as little as I did love them, they were not bound to regard me with affection, a thing that could not sympathize with one amongst them, a heterogeneous thing, opposed to them in temperament, incapacity, propensities, a useless thing, incapable of serving their interest or adding to their pleasure, a noxious thing, treasuring the germs of indignation at their treatment, of contempt of their judgment. I know that I had a sanguine, brilliant, careless, exacting, handsome, romping child, though equally dependent and friendless. Mrs. Reed would have enjoyed my presence more complacently. Her children would have entertained for me more of the cordiality of fellow feeling. The servants would have been less prone to make me the scapegoat of the nursery. Daylight began to forsake the Red Room. It was past 4 o'clock, and the beclouded afternoon was tending to dear twilight. I heard the rain still beating continuously on the staircase window, and the wind howling in the grove behind the hall. I grew by degrees cold as a stone, and then my courage sank. My habitual mood of humiliation, self-doubt, forlorn depression, fell damp on the embers of my decaying ire. All said I was wicked, and perhaps I might be so. What thought had I been just conceiving of starving myself to death? That certainly was a crime, and was I fit to die? Or was the vault under the chancel of Gateshead Church an inviting bourne? In such vault, I had been told, did Mr. Reed lie. that she would rear and maintain me as one of her own children. Mrs. Reed probably considered that she had kept this promise, and so she had, I dare say, as well as her nature would permit her. But how could she really like an interloper, not of her race, and unconnected with her, after her husband's death, by any tie? A singular notion dawned upon me. I doubted not, never doubted, that if Mr. Reed had been alive, he would have treated me kindly. And now, as I sat looking at the white bed and overshadowed walls, occasionally also turning a fascinated eye towards the dimly gleaming mirror, I began to recall what I had heard of dead men, troubled in their graves by the violation of their last wishes, revisiting the earth to punish the perjured and avenge the oppressed. And I thought Mr. Reed's spirit, harassed by the wrongs of his sister's child, might quit its abode, whether in the church vault or in the unknown world of the departed, and rise before me in this chamber. I wiped my tears and hushed my sobs, fearful lest any sign of violent grief might waken a preternatural voice to comfort me, or elicit from the gloom some haloed face bending over me with strange pity. This idea, consolatory in theory, I felt would be terrible if realized. With all my might, I endeavored to stifle it. I endeavored to be firm, shaking my hair from my eyes. I lifted my head and tried to look boldly round the dark room. At this moment, a light gleamed on the wall. Was it, I asked myself, a ray from the moon, penetrating some aperture in the blind? No, moonlight was still, and this stirred while I gazed. It glided up to the ceiling and quivered over my head. I can now conjecture readily that this streak of light was, in all likelihood, a gleam from a lantern carried by someone across the lawn. But then, prepared as my mind was for horror, shaken as my nerves were by agitation, I thought the swift darting beam was a herald of some coming vision from another world. My heart beat thick, my head grew hot, a sound filled my ears, which I deemed the rushing of wings. Something seemed near me. I was oppressed, suffocated. Endurance broke down. I rushed to the door and shook the lock in desperate effort. Steps came running along the outer passage. The key turned. Bessie and Abbott entered. "Miss Eyre, are you ill?" said Bessie. "What a dreadful noise! It went quite through me," exclaimed Abbott. "Take me out. Let me go into the nursery," was my cry. "What more? Are you hurt? Have you seen something?" again demanded Bessie. "Oh, I saw a light, and I thought a ghost would come." I had now got hold of Bessie's hand, and she did not snatch it from me. "She has screamed out on purpose," declared Abbott, in some disgust. And what a scream! If she had been in great pain, one would have excused it. But she only wanted to bring us all here. I know her naughty tricks. "What is all this?" demanded another voice, peremptorily, and Mrs. Reed came along the corridor, her cap flying wide, her gown rustling stormily. "Abbott and Bessie, I believe I gave orders that Jane Eyre should be left in the Red Room till I came to her myself." "Miss Jane screamed so loud, ma'am," pleaded Bessie. "Let her go," was the only answer. "Loose Bessie's hands, child. You cannot succeed in getting out by these means, be assured. I abhor artifice, particularly in children. It is my duty to show you the tricks will not answer. You will now stay here an hour longer, and it is only on condition of perfect submission and stillness that I shall liberate you then. Oh, aunt, have pity. Forgive me. I cannot endure it. Let me be punished some other way. I shall be killed if—" "Silence! This most repulsive, and so, no doubt, she felt it. I was a precocious actress in her eyes. She sincerely looked on me as a compound of virulent passions, mean spirit, and dangerous duplicity. Bessie and Abbott having retreated, Mrs. Reed, impatient of my now frantic anguish and wild sobs, abruptly thrust me back and locked me in without further parley. I heard her sweeping away, and soon after she was gone, I suppose I had a species of fit. Unconscious closed the scene. Chapter 3. The next thing I remember is waking up with a feeling as if I had had a frightful nightmare, and seeing before me a terrible red glare crossed with thick black bars. I heard voices, too, speaking with a hollow sound, and as if muffled by a rush of wind or water. Agitation, uncertainty, and an all-predominating sense of terror confused my faculties. Ere long, I became aware that someone was handling me, lifting me up and supporting me in a sitting posture, and that more tenderly than I had ever been raised or held up before. I rested my head against a pillow or an arm and felt easy. In 5 minutes more, the cloud of bewilderment dissolved. I knew quite well that I was in my own bed, and that the red glare was the nursery fire. It was night. A candle burnt on the table. Bessie stood at the bed foot with a basin in her hand, and a gentleman sat in a chair near my pillow, leaning over me. I felt an inexpressible relief, a soothing conviction of protection and security, when I knew that there was a stranger in the room, an individual not belonging to Gateshead, and not related to Mrs. Reed. Turning from Bessie, though her presence was far less obnoxious to me than that of Abbott, for instance, would have been, I scrutinized the face of the gentleman. I knew him. It was Mr. Lloyd, an apothecary, sometimes called in by Mrs. Reed when the servants were ailing. For herself and the children, she employed a physician. "Well, who am I?" he asked. I pronounced his name, offering him at the same time my hand. He took it, smiling and saying, "We shall do very well by and by." Then he laid me down and, addressing Bessie, charged her to be very careful that I was not disturbed during the night. Having given some further directions, and intimated that he should call again the next day, he departed, to my grief. I felt so sheltered and befriended while he sat in the chair near my pillow, and as he closed the door after him, all the room darkened, and my heart again sank. Inexpressible sadness weighed it down. "Do you feel as if you should sleep, miss?" asked Bessie, rather softly. Scarcely dared I answer her, for I feared the next sentence might be rough. "I will try. Would you like to drink, or could you so eat something?" "No, thank you, Bessie." "Then I think I shall go to bed, for it is past 12 o'clock, and you may call me if you want anything in the night." Wonderful civility this. It emboldened me to ask a question. "Bessie, what is the matter with me? Am I ill? You fell sick, I suppose, in the Red Room with crying. You'll be better soon, no doubt." Bessie went into the housemaid's apartment, which was near. I maids were there. They were all gone out in the carriage with their mamma. Bessie had been down in the kitchen, and she brought up with her a tart on a certain brightly painted china plate, whose bird of paradise nestling in a wreath of convolvula and rosebuds, who had been wont to stir in me a most enthusiastic sense of admiration, and which plate I had often petitioned to be allowed to take in my hand in order to examine it more closely, but had always hitherto been deemed unworthy of such a privilege. This precious vessel was now placed on my knee, and I was cordially invited to eat the circlet of delicate pastry upon it. Vain flavour, coming like most other flavours, long deferred and often wished for, too late. I could not eat the tart, and the plumage of the bird, the tints of the flowers, seemed strangely faded. I put both plate and tart away. Bessie asked if I would have a book. The word book acted as a transient stimulus, and I begged her to fetch Gulliver's Travels from the library. This book had again and again perused with delight. Bessie finished the dusting and tidying the room, and, having washed her hands, she opened a certain little drawer, full of splendid shreds of silk and satin, and began making a new bonnet for Georgiana's doll. Meantime, she sang. Her song was, "In the days when we went gypsying, a long time ago." I had often heard the song before, and always with lively delight, for Bessie had a sweet voice. At least, I thought so. But now, though her voice was still sweet, I found in its melody an indescribable sadness. Sometimes, preoccupied with her work, she sang the refrain very low, very lingeringly. "A long time ago" came out like the saddest cadence of a funeral hymn. She passed into another ballad, this time a really doleful one. "My feet they are sore, my limbs they are weary, long is the way, and the mountains are wild. Soon will the twilight close moonless and dreary over the path of the poor orphan child. Why did they send me so far and so lonely, up where the moors spread and grey rocks are piled? Men are hard-hearted and kind angels only watch o'er the steps of a poor orphan child. Yet distant and soft, and the night breeze is blowing. Clouds there are none, and clear stars beam mild. God in his mercy protection is showing, comfort and hope to the poor orphan child. Even should I fall o'er the broken bridge passing, or stray in the marshes by false lights beguiled, still will the Father, with promise and blessing, take to his bosom the poor orphan child. There is a thought that for strength should avail me, though book of shelter and kindred's despoiled. Heaven is a home, and the rest will not fail me. God is a friend for the poor orphan child." "Come, Miss Jane, don't cry," said Bessie as she finished. She might as well have said to the fire, "Don't burn." But how could she divine the morbid suffering of which I was a prey? In the course of the morning, Mr. Lloyd came again. "What, already up?" said he as he entered the nursery. "Well, nurse, how is she?" Bessie answered that I was doing very well. "Then she ought to look more cheerful. Come here, Miss Jane. Your name is Jane, is it not?" "Yes, sir. Jane Eyre." "Well, you have been crying, Miss Jane Eyre. Can you tell me what about? Have you any pain?" "No, sir." "Oh, I dare say she is crying because she could not go out with the missus in the carriage," interposed Bessie. "Surely not. Why, she is too old for such pettishness." I thought so too, and my self-esteem being wounded by a false charge, I answered promptly. "I never cried for such a thing in my life. I hate going out in the carriage. I cry because I am miserable." "Oh, must be 8 or 9 years old. I was knocked down, was the blunt explanation, jerked out of me by another pang of mortified pride. But that did not make me ill, I added, while Mr. Lloyd helped himself to a pinch of stuff. As he was returning the box to his waistcoat pocket, a loud bell rang for the servants' dinner. He knew what it was. "That's for you, nurse," said he. "You can go down. I'll give Miss Jane a lecture till you come back." Bessie would rather have stayed, but she was obliged to go, because punctuality at meals was rigidly enforced at Gateshead Hall. "The fall did not make you ill." "What did then?" pursued Mr. Lloyd, when Bessie was gone. "I was shut up in a room where there is a ghost till after dark." I saw Mr. Lloyd smile and frown at the same time. "Ghost? What, you are a baby after all. You are afraid of ghosts." "Of Mr. Reed's ghost I am. He died in that room and was laid out there. Neither Bessie nor anyone else will go into it at night if they can help it. And it was cruel to shut me up alone without a candle. So cruel that I think I shall never forget it." "Nonsense. And is that what makes you so miserable? Are you afraid now, in the daylight?" "No, but night will come again before long. And besides, I am unhappy. Very unhappy for other things." "What other things? Can you tell me some of them?" How much I wished to reply fully to this question. How difficult it was to frame any answer. Children can feel, but they cannot analyze their feelings, and if analysis is partially effected in thought, they know not how to express the result of the process in words. Fearful, however, of losing this first and only opportunity of relieving my grief by imparting it, I, after a disturbed pause, contrived to frame a meagre, though, as far as it went, true response. "For one thing, I have no father or mother, brothers or sisters." "You have a kind aunt and cousins." Again I paused, then beguilingly announced, "But John Reed knocked me down, and my aunt shut me up in the Red Room." Mr. Lloyd a second time produced his snuff-box. "Don't you think Gateshead Hall a very beautiful house?" he asked he. "Are you not very thankful to have such a fine place to live at?" "It is not my house, sir. An abbot says I have less right to be here than a servant." "Pooh, you can't be silly enough to wish to leave such a splendid place." "If I had somewhere else to go, I should be glad to leave it, but I can never get away from Gateshead till I am a woman." "Perhaps you may. Who knows? Have you any relations besides Mrs. Reed?" "I think not, sir. None belonging to your father." "I don't know. I asked Aunt Reed once, and she said possibly I might have some poor, low relations called Eyre, but she knew nothing about them." "If you had such, would you like to go to them?" I reflected. Poverty looks grim to grown people, still more so to children. They have not much idea of industrious, working, respectable poverty. They think of the word only as connected with ragged clothes, scanty food, fireless grates, rude manners, and abasing vices. Poverty, for me, was synonymous with degradation. "No, I should not like to belong to poor people," was my reply. "Not even if they were kind to you?" I shook my head. I could not see how poor people had the means of being kind, and then to learn to speak like them, to adopt their manners, to be uneducated, to grow up like one of the poor women I saw sometimes nursing their children or washing their clothes at the cottage doors of the village at Gateshead. No, I was not heroic enough to school, and the recommendation was no doubt readily enough adopted. For, as Abbott said, in discussing the subject with Bessie, both sat sewing in the nursery one night after I was in bed, and as they thought asleep. Mrs. was, oh she dared say, glad enough to get rid of such a tiresome, ill-conditioned child, who always looked as if she were watching everybody and scheming plots underhand. Abbott, I think, gave me credit for being a sort of infantine Guy Fawkes. On that same occasion, I learned, for the first time from Mrs. Abbott's communications to Bessie, that my father had been a poor clergyman, that my mother had married him against the wishes of her friends, who considered the match beneath her, that my grandfather Read was so irritated at her disobedience he cut her off without a shilling, that after my mother and father had been married a year, the latter caught the typhus fever while visiting among the poor of a large manufacturing town where his curacy was situated, and where that disease was then prevalent, that my mother took the infection from him, and both died within a month of each other. Bessie, when she heard this narrative, sighed and said, "Poor Miss Jane is to be pitied too, Abbott." "Yes," responded Abbott, "if she were a nice, pretty child, one might compassionate her forlornness, but one really cannot care for such a little toad as that." "Not a great deal, to be sure," agreed Bessie. "At any rate, a beauty like Miss Georgiana would be more moving in the same condition." "Yes, I dote on Miss Georgiana,"